Welcome everybody to the first roundtable for 2023. As Chris says, we will have many more of these over the coming weeks and months. So please keep an eye out on our LinkedIn page and our website. So today, as Chris says, we've got two data experts on the first discussion. It's going to be a really interesting, lively discussion, I think. But maybe before we get into some of the detail, it'd be worth maybe getting a bit of background on Wicked Razor. Chuck, do you want to give us maybe a bit of background on the story, how Wicked Razor was founded, and the background to that?
Sure. Thanks, Darren, and thank you very much for inviting us to this roundtable. We're really excited to be here. Just by way of introduction, I'm Chuck Teixeira. I'm the founder and CEO of Wicked Razor. John's our CEO and co-founder. John and I previously actually worked at HSBC, and so the thing that we're known for is we built the world's largest wholesale banking big data environment and was part of the largest migration to Google Cloud. And our frustration at that time with looking at all these different tools in the market to manage large amounts of data on a global basis is what actually prompted us to start Wicked Razor. We fundamentally believe that a lot of the tools that are in the market don't actually meet the needs of big global organizations and deal with the reality that you have data in many different databases in many different places. And so the tools need to operate in that fragmented, messy environment. John, I don't know if you want to add a bit to our story.
Yeah. As Chuck said, at CTO, I have a background in technology, and I can tell you that the pain that we went through trying to find the right tooling to solve the problems that we came across in the data space really did contribute to the journey that we're now on.
Yeah, thanks guys, and it's a great story. And I think from what I've heard of the technology, so it's a very, very interesting, very I think there's uniqueness to what it can offer in the market. I certainly haven't seen anything like it up to this point. But maybe just to sort of get the discussion running, what is sort of current trends are you guys seeing in this sort of data management and cloud space at the moment?
Well, why don't I start? I think in 2022, the thing that we kept hearing over and over again was the data mesh. You just kept hearing data mesh, data fabric, etc. And really, data mesh is a concept. It's the idea of being able to abstract data from multiple places and put it together. The other thing, especially related to cloud, you started to hear a lot about multi-cloud environments, hybrid environments, etc. And then the other one that I would sort of add is, and I think it's more of a trend as we start to look towards 2023, is people are trying to focus on how do I use machine learning and AI to automate a lot of the data management activities. So I call it almost the automation of the CDO function, but whether or not it's, mapping your data, cataloging, metadata management, data governance, all of those things, I think there is a focus of how do we use AI and machine learning to reduce the manual efforts that currently exist.
Yeah, so you see definitely I've seen the trend when it comes to sort of, I guess, moving some of the workloads into the cloud and some of the workloads, the critical workloads, in some cases remaining on-premise effectively. I've certainly seen that trend. The whole trend around AI and using AI to sort of, I guess, replace automation in some cases with intelligent automation is an interesting one. It's not something I've seen too much of at this point. Are you guys seeing that more in the field? Is that where is that where that's coming from?
Yeah, so I think.
Sorry, Chuck. Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing quite a few changes as people are moving their workloads, right? So one of the key ones is how do you understand your data, and that's what's leading very much to the use of increased use of AI. I think the other, we were having a conversation last week. The other issue that people are having is really the data in the cloud is giving people an opportunity to really think about their data estate. And if you're smart, you use that opportunity to really think about how your business and how your users are going to start using that information in the cloud, and that therefore leads to further questions. So the trend at the moment is very much the rush to cloud, but it's also that opportunity to really try and reform the way the business works and give your business a bit of a boost in the way it uses its data.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Like when you see the rush to cloud, like are you able to quantify that in any way? Like maybe from a UK perspective, are you seeing many companies, and typically what size of organization are moving workloads to the cloud?
So we both, I think we're both grinning here. From experience, I would say that cloud is a very it makes a lot of sense, right, to move your data into cloud. We could talk for hours about why it's a good thing, but there's also a lot of think of it the carrot and the stick. Cloud companies are very keen to have your data in the cloud, various reasons, and that therefore leads to an incentive-led approach. So we've definitely seen multiple companies that have spoken to us and had personal experience of saying, actually, we have agreed with cloud vendor X that we're going to spend $10 million, $100 million, which sounds logical. And by spend, that really means store your data, right, and use the cloud services. And that incentive, if you will, gives a perverse reaction, because what it actually means is you start to get a rush of people moving to the cloud because they have to spend. It's a spending commitment, right, between the company and the vendor. So you're getting people move very, very quickly, and almost sometimes without thought, to rush to get their information into the cloud in order to meet that spending commitment. We see it all the time. It's definitely a trend.
Yeah, I have seen that myself with some of the cloud vendors. Certainly making commercially, incentives there to make that happen as quick as possible. And that definitely, from some of our customers, even the RiskXchange, we've certainly seen that they're moving a lot of stuff much quicker than what they maybe would have. But once the commercial incentives have been put in place, then it seems to drive that much quicker. So I guess it's definitely from my experience, and sounds like from your experience, that the customers are moving to the cloud. But what are the risks? This is a common question we get. Is it safe to move to the cloud? What are the common sort of the risks and threats?
There's a very easy and simple answer to this question, but it does get a lot more complex. So the top line is yes, it's incredibly safe to move your data to the cloud. And that sounds almost perverse, but I'll explain. So when your data is on-prem, right, when you have your data in legacy data centers, there is a level of security that you have within an organization, and that security can be fairly high. In fact, it can be very high depending on the parts of the business you run. So if you're financial services, there's a huge focus on security and plenty of other industries. But you can imagine when you start to put your data in a cloud environment. What is a cloud environment? It's nothing more than a set of third-party data centers. And so those cloud vendors work incredibly hard to ensure that your data is safe, because if it isn't, their business will go bust, right? Could you imagine if the large vendors have massive data leakage, the customers would leave en masse. And so they do a lot to actually ensure that your data is safe. There are concepts of encryption at rest. You have virtual private networks, and those are just a couple of very simple things that mean that your data is possibly even more secure than it would have been historically, because I certainly can remember times when our data wasn't secured on premise, and it was secured, but it wasn't encrypted. And then we move it to the cloud, and it's secure and it's encrypted. In fact, it's so encrypted that only I hold the key for that data, which is a level of security that you wouldn't normally see on premise. So to answer the question, yes, it is incredibly safe. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues, and there's plenty of problems, and I know we'll talk about some of those later. But my first thought would be yes.
Yeah. This is a common thing that comes up with some of my discussions with some customers, RiskXchange, that they're moving to the cloud, and they're almost moving because they want that level of security, right? That's why they're moving, right? They're saying, well, we can't justify investing in security teams of our own effectively. So the quickest route to get that level of security is to move to the cloud. But there's also, I think there's misunderstandings on what that actually means, right? So there's a shared responsibility there around security. And I think a lot of companies tend to think, well, it's security from the whole stack, right? They don't tend to think about it as security at the platform level. They tend to think about it as security right up to the application level. Would that be your experience of it as well?
Yeah. So as I said, the what I would say, the attack vectors start to change, right? So if you think about, yes, absolutely, your data is physically secure. It's in a very heavily secured data center. You've got a lot of experience there, people making sure that the data is physically stored and secure. However, that data is now out there. It's outside of your direct control, and I agree. It certainly becomes a different way of thinking about it, and you have to start thinking of things like APIs and how you secure them, because it's not your data center. Your data is you as in company X has to access that data. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have a pipe to that data. Fine. Is that pipe secure? Yes. Okay, great. So now the pipe is secure, but the pot of data that was previously in lots of different silos is now perhaps in smaller or one bigger silo. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that everybody can access the data? And so you start to get up to that application level. And exactly as you said, I think there's an assumption of this security, and yes, physical security, I agree, but you need to be a lot more careful about the data that your users and internal and external can now see. And that then leads to further complications, which again, we can talk about much more depth, but it's things like, well, your data used to sit in, I don't know, London, in a London data center, but now, because you're with company X, it actually sits in Belgium, or it sits in San Francisco. And what does that mean, right? What does that actually mean? So yeah, it's certainly, you have to think slightly differently about the risks and the concerns when you move your data and how you use that data once it's in the cloud.
Yeah, and I agree. Sorry, Chuck, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I was just going to use an analogy, because the way I sort of think about it is, if you think about the cloud providers, it's like buying a house, right? The cloud provider might have sold you the house. There might be deadbolts. There may be a security system. But the risk is about you as the owner. How do you actually use all those things? Did you actually turn the security system on? Did you put passwords that people can't easily guess? Did you actually remember to lock the deadbolt? And so that's the same thing with the cloud providers. The cloud providers provide you all those tools and the security, but it's a function of the users. Have they set it up all correctly, and have they remembered to turn the security on that they need?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have seen it ourselves, and that the default configuration doesn't necessarily have everything enabled. And in a lot of cases that means something is fundamental as a firewall in a lot of cases, and that needs to be enabled. And particularly with database applications, the database itself, the encryption isn't always enabled by default. So again, these are important details I guess you need to think about. But so, once a company decides they're going to move or migrate some of the data to the cloud, like what are the key things or risks, particularly cyber risks, that they need to think about while they're starting to plan and migration up to the cloud?
Well, I think one of the key things, and this is going back to that house analogy, is around the configuration. If you think about what John was describing in terms of external threats, the level of external threats is increasing, and the sophistication of cyber threats is also increasing. And so the question becomes, how are you ensuring that you're not creating any vulnerabilities in your setup such that people can actually get access to your data? And so the thing that we keep seeing over and over is it's almost back to basics. Like some of the most basic things in the configuration settings, whether or not it's as John described, do you have your own encryption keys? Is your data actually encrypted? And do you have your own encryption keys that you can control? But it can be even more basic than that. Like, do you back up your data? How, if you were attacked, can you access that backed up data? Do you actually log and monitor the activity that's going on? And then access controls. One of the things that we see over and over again is there's a rush to get data into the cloud, and then people don't think about who should have access to that data and how do we actually restrict it. People almost treat it like, oh, I've created this. It's like a candy store, all this data, everybody wants access to it. And actually, you almost need to start the opposite, where nobody has access. And then bit by bit, as you get comfortable with the controls, the access controls specifically, that you start to allow more people to access it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's definitely a rush. Even simple use cases like moving everything to Office 365, for example. There's a rush to push stuff up there to OneDrive, but it's not necessarily secured, or everybody in the organization has access to everything. So it's definitely an important one. And I guess there's an argument to say that should be part of the planning, right? You need to sit down and define the policy around that. Who should have access to what before you even start to sort of implement the migration piece itself, the technical piece, I guess. Would that be right?
Yeah, and I would take it one step further. It's not even who should have access to what, but for how long. One of the things that the cloud enables is that actually you can dynamically give access to people so if you're that for a specific duration, so that hey, if I needed access to this data because I'm working on this project, when the project is over, my access should be taken away.
Yeah, that's a good point. So that's because more often than not, it's enabled, and it's sort of forgot about in a lot of cases, right? So that's it's not necessarily checked again once it's been turned on for a particular project, or maybe for a certain employee, they have a certain role and they need access, but then when they move to a different department, it's never removed, right? So you see lots of scenarios around that. And what would be your recommendation around how to deal with that sort of problem if you're moving data to the cloud?
So I think the challenge here is really trying to ensure that the data is fit for use and that you're allowed to use it, right? There's two threads, and I think access control is a very big area. We could, again, I don't want to really go into the ins and outs of that, but what you really need is the ability to say, I have access to this data for a period of time, right? It has to be a finite level and it needs to be actively monitored. So I start on the Monday, I do my work, by Friday, my access is automatically revoked. And the reason that I say automatically is because the cloud is infinitely large. And as people rush to cloud, they put a lot of data up there. And some of that data is repeated. That's a problem we can talk about. But there's just pots and pots and pots of information. And what will happen, and as Chuck has explained, is people get that access and then, does it ever go away? So access control is not just the ability to physically get access, it's making sure that access is similarly revoked. And the other thing is, what data should you see? What data are you allowed to see? In the olden days, I'm going to put that in quotes, in the olden days, it was very carefully controlled. I would go and say, I need access to this system over here. The expert in that system or the owner of that system would say, yes, absolutely. I know who you are and I know why you want it, and you may have access. Now, this data is all in the cloud. Right? It's in the cloud. It's in this big fluffy thing, and there's pots of it. So that system has been migrated to the cloud because someone's done the technical work to do that. But now who is controlling access and how is that controlled? Is it still the system owner? Maybe not. Maybe it's a central cloud team, or maybe it's someone else. And so we need to ensure that when you have a request to access data, it's what you're physically getting access to is the right thing for you and for the reasons that you need it for.
Yeah, so I guess that comes back down to something that needs to be thought about ahead of time, right, before the migration.
It does, but also you need to have active monitoring. Is my view. You need the ability to be able to understand what people want and to be able to give them that information in a sensible time frame. There are plenty of ways that can be achieved. But I don't often see it in implementations because I'm coming back to that rush, that almost that gold rush to the cloud. Everybody's so invested in moving their data. It's a secondary thought. And you're right, that absolutely needs to be pre-planning. But it's an active monitoring as well. Once that data's there, how do you control it? How do you continue to control it?
Yeah. So I hate to throw in this term, but I will throw it in because I'm interested to understand what it means, and not necessarily what it means, but how does it add or take away from the conversation we're having. So zero trust, right, is a buzzword. It's heavily overused at the moment, and it can mean many things to many men and women. And like, what's your view on that? Like some of the points you're covering there, some companies would argue this is part of the zero trust model.
So again, this to me, and I'm very careful as I say this, right? This is very much in that sphere of word. If I were to draw a word cloud, zero trust would certainly be there. I think, data mesh, data fabric, data, all these, there's buzzwords. But what are we actually saying, right? We're saying that I shouldn't have access to anything that by default, really, right? That's what we really want. And what I want to then say is I'm now authenticated in some way, and by being authenticated, you know who I am, and therefore what I'm allowed to see, right? That's fundamentally, in my view, what zero trust means. So it's, call that blacklist if you like. So at default, you have access to nothing. And you think about it in context of the cloud. That's why it's so important, because your data is no longer in your direct control. It's not in that nice secure data center in London anymore. It's somewhere in Belgium or San Francisco. You have to operate in that way. You have to make sure that your data is absolutely secure. And so how do we ensure that? Well, we go and we have some form of authentication that is trusted enough by you to say, yes, you've authenticated as, John Farina. I know exactly who you are, and therefore I should know what you have access to. But now you have a missing piece, because okay, we've authenticated the fact that it's me and that I'm an employee of the company and that I'm in these groups and I should have access to all these different systems and services. But should I have access to that data? Question. What is that data? And I can give you examples, right? I could say, let's take a contrived example. I work in a pharmaceutical company and I'm looking at patient information. Should I have access to patient information? Is it part of my role? Well, it's there in the cloud. I'm authenticated. How do you control that? And those, when I talk about that continual monitoring, that's a sort of thing. We certainly are at Wicked Razor. We're constantly thinking about it, but it comes up in conversations all the time.
And we're obviously slightly biased on this because our whole premise is that every data request should be validated, both between the users, their intent, as well as what the rules are. So that you're not just openly giving access to data and then that person has perpetual access and can use it for whatever use cases or purpose they want to use it for.
Yeah, so it's a case of authorization, I guess. It's real-time authorization, effectively.
It is, and to use another analogy, it's a bit, if you imagine bubble wrap, right? That stuff that you pop the little bubbles on, and all that packaging you get. To me, zero trust is a bit like that, and how we access data and in fact services in the cloud and really off cloud should act like that. That little bubble, that's the thing I'm working on. That's my access. That's it. I can pop that little bubble, but I'm not popping any other bubbles. I don't necessarily have access to those other pots of data or those other services because I've been authenticated just on that one bubble, that one service. And we believe data should work in the same way. If I'm given permission to access patient information on a particular service, I access that patient information on that particular service. I don't have free reign around the rest of the organization.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Sorry, go ahead, Chuck.
And going back to your very first question to me about trends for 2023, part of the whole thing that is enabled is with AI and machine learning is a lot of these things can be done dynamically in literally milliseconds. So it doesn't become onerous to the organization. In the old days, when the CDO function used to report to me, a lot of those controls around access are manual, and hence why it's done once. Whereas now, by leveraging the latest in terms of technology, you can do it in milliseconds on a transaction by transaction or data request by data request basis.
Yeah, no, that was one of my questions. It sounds like a perfect control. That it's fine grained effectively, only giving them access to what they need, but that can also create a very big management overhead. In terms of trying to maintain that. So I can totally get where the AI fits in to help reduce some of that overhead. So, what how would a company implement this type of control? Would they go to their cloud provider, whether that's AWS or Google Cloud or whoever that is, right, and say, hey, we want this fine-grained control, real-time monitoring authorization. What sort of questions would they ask their cloud providers to get access to these types of features?
Sure. I think we have to take sort of a step back first. I think the company itself needs to set what the control framework is and what controls and what specific rules that they want to implement. Because the risk is, and what we see a lot is, people might use one cloud provider, they might use two cloud providers, and then they have an on-prem environment. And actually, the control framework is different for each one because they use different tooling. And so, in fact, the latest cloud provider that they might use might have the most dynamic and the most comprehensive. But then, what about all the rest of the data that you have? So, I think the one thing that's whatever they want to implement, they need to be able to think about, how do I implement this across my entire data estate, both in the cloud and on-prem. So I think that's sort of the first thing. In terms of looking at a specific cloud vendor and sort of what are the things that need to start thinking about and what discussions they should have with that cloud vendor about their control framework, they need to be thinking about, how is the transfers going to be work? Am I creating any vulnerabilities when I transfer data from my on-prem environment to the cloud and then pull that data back? We've talked a lot about this already today, but the access controls, who has access, not only internally in terms of my employees, but if customers or partners or other external people are going to start having access to the data, what controls do I have over that? And as John has emphasized, what monitoring do I have to ensure that people are using the data appropriately? And then, highlighting some of the things that I said before, things about backup and, logging and those very basic things. But actually, you'd be surprised at how many times when people do their cloud migrations that actually people go, oh, well, it's so expensive for me to back up the data, I'm not going to do that. And then what happens when you actually do have a cyber attack or something else, an operational error occurs, and your data store, you can't get access to it. What do you do then? So some of those things, people need to really consider and have those discussions with their cloud vendors about as they set up their control framework.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wasn't aware that there's different control frameworks for different vendors. I assumed that was a sort of generic model would have been used. No?
It's not the framework itself, it's the tooling on how they manage, whether or not it's access controls, different things like that. So each provider has their sort of almost favorite vendors that they typically tend to use, and the configuration setting tends to be different. And so if you're a big global organization and you're dealing with, let's say, 3 different cloud vendors, each one is a different configuration. And so you're trying to manage that amongst the different cloud providers and then your own on-prem environment. So it becomes a whole mishmash, shall we say.
Yeah, I can imagine. In sort of preparation for moving this data to the cloud, what sort of questions should they be asked in the cloud? Their chosen cloud providers, or maybe in some cases they have 2 cloud providers, right? So that becomes more challenging. I've certainly seen lots of companies that are using AWS for one particular workload and they're using Azure for a different workload.
So I think I would have to double check, but I would say my very first question would be, how is the data encrypted? Right now, when Chuck and I first started this journey at a previous organization, the cloud provider encrypted the data, but the cloud provider held the keys to the data. Now that's not okay, right? Now, from a cloud provider's perspective, they were like, well, this is fine, right? Your data is encrypted, don't worry about it. And from an organization's perspective, I'm thinking, but this is my data. This is information about my clients. This is sensitive information that I hold about my clients, and I've got a duty of trust. So I'm going to hold the encryption keys. Thank you very much. And so, you know, there's an acronym for that. It's called CMEC, Customer Managed Encryption Keys. And I'm 90% sure all cloud providers now provide customer managed keys, and I, as the customer, hold the key. That is important to me. That would be the very first question I'd be asking, right? And the second question is around access control, not my user access control, but just access to the data. Chuck just mentioned it, but it's super important. Who can access my data physically and operationally? If there's an outage, is it taking AWS as an example, is it the AWS security staff or support staff that can access my data? How do they access my data? How do you monitor AWS? How do you monitor the access to my data, or the fact that anybody's touching my data or can see my data? How do we know that? So what you know, those are the questions I'd be asking, as well as the much higher level questions around how do you manage access control? How do you manage data discovery? How do you manage physical security and application security? Because, you know, one of the biggest problems that you see in a cloud is misconfiguration, right? So I saw a statistic the other day, over 80% of incidents are due to misconfiguration. So what tooling does that cloud provider provide? And I know from experience, AWS and Google Cloud provide very good tools to scan your APIs to try and look for vulnerabilities. And that's an important aspect, because perhaps before it was about locking your data in a cupboard. Well, now it's out there, right? It's out on the internet, and yes, it's in a VPC perhaps, but let's just be really clear that only the right people can access the data. So those are the sort of questions I'd be asking.
Yeah, I totally agree. To me, it doesn't make any sense to put your data in the cloud and give the keys to the hosting provider. You know, at the end of the day, it is your data. So that absolutely should be a fundamental requirement, I would have thought, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and if I can add it from a business point of view, you know, one of the risks tied to the access of that cloud providers to your data is subpoena risk. So in the event, you know, if especially because these are a lot of them are US based cloud providers, if the organization got subpoenaed, do they have the ability to actually go and access your data and turn it over? And then that almost becomes the litmus test for you as to what would they do in that situation, but and how would they do it? So, you know, do they have a lockbox where they can go break in and actually access your encryption keys? Will they actually go into the data, etc.? Do they have an obligation to inform you, even if there's a gag order on it, etc., etc.? So that plays out almost a step by step of whether or not the organization truly has access to your data and can access it without you knowing.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I guess it comes down to where that data has actually been stored, right? Which geography or whose sovereignty over it effectively.
That's a great point, right? And we haven't really touched on it, but data sovereignty or cross-border data access, if you will, is actually something. It's a fairly new concern if you think about it, because again, historically, your data was stored in your London data center, and you're a London company based in London or wherever you are, and that's fine. But now that data may be stored in San Francisco. Well, hang on. Does that data now have to comply with any data security laws in California, CCPA, for example? And if it does, are you as an organization compliant? And if you're not, can you be fined? What about GDPR? Everybody knows about GDPR, right? Well, it's the European access control, data access policy. So you've got GDPR, but there's a whole host of these. So if your data is stored in Hong Kong or China, what now? How do you make sure that you're compliant? And those are, I mean, you know, we don't all have the answer to these questions, but there are certainly considerations now that your data is no longer sitting in one location or in data centers that previously in, I don't know, one geography or three geographies. They could be anywhere in the world. And part of that setup, maybe to your point, Darren, earlier, is really making sure that when you migrate, you don't just go and open, you know, sort of a data bucket up in the cloud. You go, hang on, I want that bucket to be sitting in a London cloud data center, because then I'm comfortable, right? And you can, and again, most providers, and don't want to be specific, but most providers will allow you to pick a region and almost down to the location within the region for that reason.
Yeah, exactly. And we get the same requests from our US customers versus our European customers. The US customers want the data to be retained within the US, naturally. And the same for the European customers. They want their data retained within Europe. And unfortunately, in the UK now, the variations in data protection could mean that you need to store it in the UK, not in Europe.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right, so that's another challenge.
And it's the backup as well, because a lot of people forget that, okay, you may have stored your data in, let's say, if you're based in the UK, in a UK data center, but if you haven't specified with your cloud provider where the backup is going to be stored, it could be stored in the US or somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen some cases where the data is actually, moved dynamically in some cases, right? And your customers aren't aware of that at all. So I think it's a whole, you could probably spend a lot more time delving into the controls and data sovereignties, particularly. I think it's a very important topic. But in interest of time, I guess we should try and move the conversation forward. But so what about, so the companies decided they're going to move to the cloud. What sort of things do they need to think about in terms of preparation, moving from on-prem to cloud? Is there any particular key points they should think about?
Well, just the most basic, warning that we always say to everybody is, however long you think it's going to take and however easy you think it's going to be, double, it's going to be twice as long and twice as hard. So just as, part of the whole thing that, just in all seriousness, the thing that most organizations need to really consider is you're never going to be able to, especially for a big organization, you're never going to be able to move all your data lock, stock, and barrel into one single cloud provider. You're still going to retain some on-prem, or you're going to put it amongst several cloud providers. And so part of the whole thing is, how do you think about operating in that multi-cloud environment? Or, hybrid, where it's, a cloud provider and an on-prem environment. And how do you aggregate when your data is in multiple places so that you can, use your applications, your models, do your analytics, etc.
Yeah, no, it's an important point, because it's not necessarily everybody's moving everything 100% to the cloud. They're leaving, as we said at the beginning, they're leaving some workloads on-prem, or in some cases, I've certainly seen workloads split between cloud and on-prem, depending on the resource requirements and what have you. So I think it's an interesting challenge, and it's not something I've heard many people talking about. Like again, is there be any more? Can you sort of elaborate on those sort of things they might should think about?
I think the first thing is, and this is me putting my old, head of transformation hat on, is that one of the biggest mistakes that we see organizations make as they do the cloud journey is they effectively, because they have pressures in terms of they've signed a multi-year commitment, they have spending commitments each year. What they tend to do is, and because it ends up being harder than they think, is they start to replicate what they had on-prem in the cloud. And so my number one piece of advice is, before they actually engage in that cloud journey, and thinking about whether or not it's hybrid or how it's all going to work, is not to waste the opportunity to actually strategically transform your data estate. John highlighted the fact that what ends up happening in your current estate is that you've got multiple copies of the data everywhere. And then you go and you start migrating data to the cloud, and you create another copy. So you have this whole proliferation. And this, we talked about access controls. The access control models are very, antiquated. And so you don't manage dynamically. So thinking about, okay, what does my strategic architecture look like in the cloud or in a hybrid environment? And what are the things that I'm going to do to ensure that I have one copy of the data, that I can manage the access controls dynamically, that the data is used, be it with specific tooling in mind or in a specific architecture. So thinking about those things and planning that first and then doing the execution is really critical. Otherwise, what people end up doing is, because they're so panicked and they need to meet these spending commitments, is they just start spraying data up in the cloud, and they literally just use it almost as a data storage or to do specific operations, as opposed to much more of a dynamic migration and creating a whole new set of data capabilities by migrating to a cloud provider.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And like, typically, you mentioned that these projects take much longer than what you ever expect. I think that's the case in a lot of IT projects, to be honest. What is there a typical sort of timeline around planning versus, I know the execution, getting the data depends on the amount of data you're moving, but is there typically a project length for these types of things, or is that maybe a silly question?
So I would say from a technology perspective, my experience has been these projects can take an inordinate amount of time for a couple of reasons. There's nothing different. I mean, I'm generalizing slightly. There's nothing different about having your data in the cloud, physically in the cloud, than there is on-prem, right? If it's a database, if it's a Postgres database running in GCP, it's the same as running a Postgres database in a data center. However, from a technology perspective, there are two challenges that I've seen multiple times. In fact, one is that, I think you said it, Darren, is how you get your data to the cloud, right? When we were looking at this, and Chuck and I were trying to build the data platform that we did, we were seriously talking about hiring vans to ship data, right? And certain cloud providers will actually provide that service to physically take your hard disks and plug them in, because there's so much data to move. Now, that may not be a consideration depending on the project, but that is something to think about, right? I can give an anecdote of one organization who shall remain nameless. They started moving some data quite innocently to the cloud, and they just kept moving it. And come Monday morning, people were finding it very difficult to use the network, right? And what was actually happening is the physical pipe that is being used to transmit the bits and bytes all the way up to the internet and back was saturated by this team of people moving data to a cloud provider, physically saturated. So, I mean, you would hope that doesn't happen, but it absolutely does. So there's a physical thing to think about. But the one that hits me every time is we've now decided that, and we've talked about a lot of this, right, in this conversation, we have to be very careful because it's a third party. How do we secure it? What are the controls? How do we encrypt it? So what that leads to is every organization creating a new team or a new group, call them the cloud team if you like. And that cloud team's responsibility is to ensure that whichever project is moving is doing it in a very secure way. But what that leads to is if you're going at 10 miles an hour in your project, you're now going at 2 miles an hour because that cloud team either isn't resourced enough, it can't scale horizontally enough, and so there's a point of contention. There's a bottleneck, right? And so you've got 100 projects, because remember, you've got the spending commitments to try and get your data into cloud, and you've got one cloud team, and every project has to go through that team. And so if you're smart, you have to pull that cloud team's responsibility down to the project level. Unfortunately, organizations don't always do that, and so you have a bottleneck, and that therefore elongates your project time. So it can be a challenge from many aspects.
And one of the things people underestimate is there is the technology considerations in terms of physically how do we unpick something that maybe is, for example, on a mainframe and migrate it into a cloud. But then there's a whole set of operating models, processes, activities, things that data was being used for in the first place. And you don't realize how many reporting activities, other operational activities happen with that data. And so when you do that migration, you've got to unpick all of those activities and say, how is that going to work in the new world? And if that data source was feeding, let's say, 100 different systems, models, applications, etc., you've got to redo it. And part of the frustration that people have is that, the data migrates to a new environment, all of a sudden their model breaks or their application breaks, and then they go and say, hey, wait a minute, where's my data? And they're like, oh, well, it's now in X cloud provider. Oh, well, I need it for this. And they're like, well, get in line, because I've got a queue of things that I've got to work on. And so that's part of the thing that people just don't actually think about is it's all those activities and processes that need to be changed.
Yeah, but that's back to the planning, right? It's back to thorough planning and investigation of data flows, application access to data, permissions, users. There's a lot of work, I guess, in the planning stages of it. And I guess it's important to, or maybe it's not, but what's your point of view? Is it important to involve the business in these types of discussions? Because in a lot of cases, the IT team sort of take responsibility. They're left with the job to do this, and ultimately they execute it. But at the end of the day, it's about access and who has access to the data itself.
Yeah, I think again, unfortunately, speaking from experience, you're absolutely right. You plan and you say, right, I've done my analysis. I know these 10 business people use this data. I've notified those 10 people, and I'm now moving my data, and we've agreed a path to remediate their particular applications or reports. And then you move the data, or you start to move the data, and another 100 people come out the woodwork, right? And it's the unexplained ones, and that can be challenging because you think but you don't really know. And this almost talks back to something we discussed earlier, which who's using the data and for what purpose? Because remember, data is you give access to data and you're rarely ever take it away. And so that means that data can proliferate and be used for other purposes, sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly. And so if our control mechanism is such that I only have access for the week that I need the data, this problem is very simple, right? You notify the people who currently have access, away you go. Doesn't really work like that in practice, because unless you have the right tooling, you have a legacy issue where who knows who has access, and that person or group of people could be incredibly important, and that puts the brakes on the project, or puts brakes on the migration, or elongates the migration. So those are known issues.
Yeah, you sort of hit on a key point there. It's in a lot of cases, most organizations don't have a clear view of who has access to the data currently.
Yep.
So it's very hard to know if it should be implemented that way or changed as part of the migration. And it sounds like planning is key, right? That's one of the most important things, rather than sort of just leap in and start transferring data. And certainly don't try to transfer it through your company's broadband connection. That's probably a major mistake. Think about how you're going to get that data in gigabytes potentially of it up to the cloud providers. And I've never heard of that physically transporting data, but that's an interesting way to do it.
When you transfer petabytes of data, having a single pipe to transfer it, it's almost impossible. So you have to think about how are you going to manage transfers at scale.
Yeah, exactly. So we're sort of almost out of time, guys. Any final thoughts? Anything we sort of haven't covered that you think would be useful for the audience to learn?
I'll start. I mean, and it's actually a point that you raised, Darren, which is about the business buy-in. I actually, I might be slightly biased as a former COO, but I actually think it needs to be business driven. And so part of the whole thing is the move to cloud shouldn't be technology for technology's sake. And so part of the question is, what is the business benefit by migrating to the cloud? And how are we going to now use that data in the cloud? So it's being very strategic about why we're doing it, what we're going to get out of it, and ensuring then that the business and technology are partnered up in making sure that that's a success.
Yeah.
I think I would, from a technology perspective, the two things I would say that should be really thought about is coming back to some themes, data residency, right? It's an emerging piece, and it needs to be thought about. Are you being compliant with the policies and controls for any given geographic location? question. And I think the second piece is really understand, and this is painful for me, but understand where your data is, right? Because in that rush, many technology teams and many business teams are so desperate to either be the first, get there quickly, whatever the rationale is, they're just creating duplicates and duplicates and creating another mess of information. So think about that, right? How do you solve that problem? Do you restrict what data goes to the cloud? Do you use that opportunity, as we said earlier, to really rethink your environment? Or is it simply just have a map? Have a map of that data, have a data catalog, a true catalog of where your data is, so that your businesses, your technology teams can actually understand what data is there, and we can start to use it appropriately.
Yeah, good points, guys. Really good points to wrap up. So there's been no questions come in this particular discussion, but I'm sure people that will watch this afterwards may have some additional questions. So how would they get in touch with you guys? What's the best way to reach out to you?
Well, they can either reach out to us directly on LinkedIn, or they can reach out to us on email. So I'm chuck@wickedrazor.com. John's John@wickedrazor.com. So it's not. It's pretty easy to reach.
Very simple.
Very good. So you guys are easy to get. Excellent. All right. Well, listen, it just remains for me to say thank you very much for taking the time to do this roundtable discussion. I found it very useful, and I'm sure the people watching have found it very useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.